So I want you to imagine doing something incredibly simple. You are sitting there, maybe you're listening to us right now, and you decide the audio is just a bit too quiet.
Right, you want to hear better.
Exactly. So you reach out and you turn up the volume on your smartphone. But think about what you actually just did. You just tapped a flat piece of glass. Or maybe you pressed a stiff little plastic button on the side.
There is absolutely no dial anywhere.
None. There is no knob. There is no physical turning motion whatsoever. I mean, it makes literally no sense. Yet we say it every single day.
We do, yeah. And welcome to the deep dive, by the way.
Yes, welcome. Today, we are cracking open a massive stack of research. We are talking linguistics, acoustics, psychology, all focused entirely on one tiny phrasal verb, which is turn up.
It really is a masterclass in how language evolves, you know.
It is. And our mission today is to show you how these two simple words act as a sort of hidden blueprint. It's not just some grammar quirk. This phrase reveals exactly how our brains process technology, how we map physical space, and ultimately how we can subtly manipulate human behavior.
Yeah, if you want a shortcut to understanding the hidden mechanics of English, analyzing this one phrase gives you the keys to the kingdom. We use it constantly and, like you said, completely unconsciously, despite the fact that the physical action has been obsolete for decades.
Right.
We're going to trace how a mechanical movement from the 1920s mutated into this hypnotic persuasion tool that gets used in modern corporate boardrooms.
Okay, let's unpack this from the very beginning, because we have to start at the literal historical origin. Like, why did this specific combination of words even come into existence, and how on earth did it survive the death of the machinery that created it?
Well, to understand the origin, you kind of have to mentally transport yourself back to the early days of audio technology.
Okay, I'm there.
We were talking about the very first commercially available radios, those early gramophones, and the massive wooden television sets from the mid-20th century, long before digital interfaces or touchscreens existed.
So the ones with those heavy, clunky dials and knobs.
Exactly. Physical knobs that offered real mechanical resistance. If you wanted to change a setting, whether it was tuning a frequency or increasing the volume, you had to physically pinch a knob with your fingers and rotate it.
Right.
And engineers in the 1920s and 30s began to standardize the design of these interfaces. They decided that to increase power, voltage, or volume, the user should rotate the knob clockwise.
So you had to literally turn it. I get that part. But where does the up come from? I mean, a knob just spins in a circle, right?
It does, but think about what that clockwise rotation looks like visually. As you grip a circular knob and turn it to the right, the top edge of that dial physically moves in an upward arc.
Ouch.
But more importantly, these early machines had little linear scales printed directly onto the metal or the wood casing right behind the knob. 0, which is total silence, was anchored at the bottom.
And the max volume was at the top.
Yes, the maximum level was at the very top.
Ah, so by turning the knob, you were mechanically driving an indicator needle, or like a painted line, literally up a vertical scale.
That is the exact mechanical birth of the phrase. But the fascinating part is what happened next. Because as we know, technology moved on. We shifted away from rotary knobs to those vertical sliding faders on mixing boards and then to push buttons.
And eventually to completely flat glass touchscreens.
Exactly. The physical act of turning vanished entirely from the user experience, but the particle up had already successfully fused with the verb turn in the collective consciousness of English speakers.
It's like a linguistic ghost, just pure cultural muscle memory. It actually reminds me of how we still tell people we're going to hang up the phone, you know?
Oh, that's a perfect example.
Yeah, even though no one has aggressively slammed a plastic receiver onto a physical wall hook in like over 30 years, we don't say we're going to tap off the phone. We hang it up.
That is a brilliant comparison. And the reason these phrases survive technological extinction comes down to something linguists call cognitive metaphor theory.
Okay, what is that?
Well, this framework suggests that the human mind is fundamentally incapable of processing pure abstraction. To understand abstract concepts, we have to map them onto our real-world physical experiences of navigating space.
Interesting.
So turn up survived because it taps into two massive universal conceptual metaphors. And the first one is simply more is UP.
Okay, make that concrete for me. How does more inherently equal up?
We inherently view higher quantities as a vertical rise because of how gravity works in the physical world. If you stack a pile of books, the pile physically gets taller.
Right. Prices go up. The stock market goes up.
Exactly. So when it comes to audio, higher volume equals a greater quantity of sound, therefore it must go up.
That makes total sense. I mean, if you pour water into a glass, you're adding more liquid, and the water level literally rises vertically before your eyes.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
I want you to visualize that spatial concept for a second.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine silence is anchored at the absolute bottom of a room. It is the floor. Loudness is this vertical climb toward the ceiling.
Okay, I can picture that.
But there's a second layer to this, which is status ICP. And that basically means power is up. Louder sounds possess more acoustic energy, right? They physically dominate the environment.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And we instinctively map that dominance onto a vertical axis. Over time, because of these metaphors, the word up actually transitioned in English grammar. It stopped being just a spatial direction and became what's called an aspectual particle.
Wait, an aspectual particle, you were going to have to translate that into plain English for me. What does that actually mean?
It just means the word up is now acting as a grammatical marker of completion or extreme intensity. Consider the difference between simply burning a piece of paper and burning it up.
Oh, or like drinking a glass of water versus drinking it up.
Precisely. Adding up implies taking the action to its absolute limit.
Yeah.
So in the phrase turn up, the word up transforms the action from just aimlessly spinning a dial into this goal-oriented, intensive action of maximizing power.
So we have this deep spatial and conceptual mapping living in our brains. But what really surprised me in the research is that this isn't just a mental exercise. Saying this phrase literally forces the human body, like specifically the mouth and throat, to physically perform the concept.
It is a profound physical reaction. When we look at how native speakers actually vocalize this phrase, we dive into the mechanics of connected speech.
Okay.
In rapid, everyday conversation, native speakers do not say two distinct words. They don't pause and say turn and then up. They instinctively erase the boundary between the words to save breath and effort.
Hold on. I think I know where you were going with this. This is about how the consonant blends into the vowel, right?
Yes, it is a process called resyllabification.
Oh.
Because the word turn ends in a consonant sound, the N, and the word up begins with a vowel sound, the U, the mouth, looks for the path of least resistance.
Right. You're not going to stop all the airflow just to start again.
Exactly. The N physically detaches from the end of the first word, becomes the starting sound of the second word. So instead of a hard break, the airflow merges it into
Turn up. Turn up.
Yeah, it's completely fused together into one fluid motion. But the mechanics get significantly wilder when you drop a pronoun into the middle of it.
This is where the grammar forces your mouth into some serious gymnastics. English rules dictate that object pronouns, like the word it, must be placed right in the middle of a separable phrasal verb.
Right, you cannot tell someone to turn up it.
No, you are required to say turn it up. And when you do that, the acoustics shift entirely, triggering what linguists call the American flap T.
You just lost me again. Break down the American flap T. Like, what is my tongue actually doing when I say turn it up?
Let's slow down the mouth movements. First, you have that same liquid link we just talked about. The N, in turn, glides smoothly into the I of the word it. That gives you turn it.
Okay, turn it.
But now, the hard T at the end of it is suddenly trapped between two vowel sounds, the I before it and the U of up, right after it. In American English, when a T gets sandwiched between two vowels like that, the mouth softens the impact.
It doesn't sound so harsh.
Right. Instead of a harsh stopping T sound, your tongue quickly bounces or flaps against the alveolar ridge at the roots of your mouth. It transforms the sharp T into a fast, voiced sound that lands somewhere close to a light D.
So instead of a rigid turn it up, it transforms into this rapid, bouncy,
Turn it up. Turn it up.
I can actually feel my tongue flicking against the roof of my
Yeah,
mouth.
you can feel the bounce.
It creates this incredibly specific rhythm. Short, short, long, da-da-bam.
You are naturally highlighting the prosodic rhythm of the language there. English is a stress-timed language. Pronouns carry almost no semantic weight. They're just structural glue, so the word it is completely unstressed and rushed.
So all the way it falls on the end.
Exactly. The heavy vocal stress lands like a hammer on the particle UP. This phonetic structure actually mimics the physical meaning of the phrase. You create a sonic bridge in the throat. You start with the rolling, continuous turn, and then you hit the glottal launch of the U, terminating instantly on the P, where the lips snap completely shut.
Up.
Physically hit an acoustic ceiling.
Which brings us to one of the most mind-bending connections in this whole deep dive, the way our bodies react to the sound.
Up.
Because the research draws this phonetic bridge to a command used in European and Asian circuses, the Slavic word ap.
Ap. Yes, it is an internationally recognized acoustic cue. Trainers use it across the globe to signal acrobats, gymnasts, or performing animals to jump, or to instantly snap into a state of maximum exertion.
And there's a biological reason for that, right?
There is. The reason it is used universally is biological. The sharp, percussive burst of air required to shout
App.
naturally forces your diaphragm to contract aggressively upward. It physically aligns the speaker's internal organs and body posture with ascending energy.
Wait, I have to ask. Does this hyper-aroused physical state explain the modern slang version of turning up? Like, when younger generations talk about going to a party and turning up, does the very phonetics of the phrase make your body want to jump?
It creates a sudden kinesthetic shift, yes. Try to say
App or up.
with real force while slumping your shoulders.
Oh, that feels really weird.
It is incredibly difficult. When you vocalize that burst, your spine elongates, your chin lifts, and the muscles involved in physical extension suddenly engage. Your body mimics the exact preparation required for a jump.
That is wild.
So when someone uses the slang term turning up to describe going wild at an event, they are describing a state of hyperarousal. The heart rate accelerates. It is a sensory state where the boundary between external musical noise and internal bodily vibration completely dissolves.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Because this phrase evokes such a visceral, physical feeling of energy suddenly manifesting, it acts like a cultural chameleon.
Oh, absolutely.
It isn't just used for radios or parties. It has been adapted by classical authors, boardroom executives, and across completely different global dialects.
And its meaning drastically changes shape depending on where you are geographically and, the context you use it in. We can see this clearly in the transatlantic divide.
The difference between how we speak in the U.S. versus the U.K.
Exactly. Let's look at how we describe a person or an object arriving at a location. Americans overwhelmingly favor the phrasal verb show up. Show up implies a deliberate, intentional presence.
Right. If you show up to a meeting, you made a conscious decision to cross a boundary and be there.
But in the UK, Ireland, and Australia, speakers heavily favor turn up for arrivals. In their linguistic framework, turn up implies something accidental, passive, or entirely circumstantial.
It's the lost passport phenomenon. If I lose my passport, I would never say it showed up in my drawer. I would say it turned up. It implies the object had no agency, right? It just drifted back into reality on its own.
Yes, and you see this concept of passive, accidental arrival deeply embedded in classical literature, too.
Yeah.
Take Charles Dickens' masterpiece, David Copperfield.
Oh, the macabre principle.
Right. There's a famous concept in the book known as the macabre principle. The character Wilkins Micawber is destitute, constantly drowning in debt, but he possesses this delusional, unwavering optimism. He famously advises that one should never despair, but safely trust that something will turn up.
He has no plan. He is literally just sitting around in a chair waiting for luck or money to magically manifest out of thin air.
It is the ultimate passive hope. But then you contrast Dickens' whimsical use of the phrase with Joan Didion's usage in her 1968 essay collection, Slouching Towards Bethlehem.
That one is so much darker.
Very. She uses the exact same passive mechanism, but turns it into something haunting and psychological. She writes about the ghosts of our past actions, describing how our old mistakes turn up unannounced and surprise us, come hammering on the mind's door at 4 a.m.
Wow. By placing it in that context, she strips away all the casual, accidental lightness. Instead of a lost set of keys happily appearing, it becomes an invasive emotional reckoning. The passivity actually makes it aggressive because you can't stop the memories from arriving.
The emotional weight of the phrase shifts entirely based on the register you use it in. And when people accidentally mix up those registers in the real world, the results can be catastrophic, or at least highly embarrassing.
This makes me think of the boardroom scenario we were analyzing earlier from the sources, which is honestly hilarious. Imagine this absolute train wreck of communication.
Oh, this is a great example.
So you have a guy named Arthur. He is a rigid, old-school CEO, and his company is facing a massive, high-stakes federal financial audit. He is terrified. He pulls in Zach, his newly hired Gen Z junior marketing analyst, and asks what the team is doing to prepare. And Zach, leaning back in his chair, completely relaxed, says, "Don't even stress, Arthur. My whole team is ready. We are literally going to turn up the second the auditors walk through that door."
And Arthur, who operates entirely within the strict boundaries of professional corporate English, immediately goes into full panic mode.
Of course he does.
Because in a legal, auditing, or law enforcement context, for something to turn up means that hidden evidence, illegal data anomalies, or massive financial liabilities have been uncovered and exposed to the light of day.
Arthur thinks Zach has stumbled onto illegal financial discrepancies that are going to materialize as hard evidence. He literally thinks his junior marketer is cheerfully confessing to securities fraud.
Right. Meanwhile, Zach is simply using the modern youth slang we discussed earlier. He just means his team is going to go all out. They're going to bring maximum energy, hyperarousal, and hype to the meeting.
Amazing.
You have two completely different registers of the exact same phrasal verb colliding in real time, resulting in total corporate chaos.
Which raises a huge question for me. If the meaning shifts so drastically based on context, how does someone learning English as a second language navigate these treacherous waters without making a massive faux pas? Because I imagine the nouns you pair this verb with must be a total minefield.
It is a significant hurdle. In linguistics, we look at collocations, which are the specific nouns that naturally bond with a certain verb. Because turn up has so many divergent meanings, it bonds with highly specific noun groups. You can turn up a machine's volume, you can turn up the metaphorical pressure on an opponent in a negotiation, or, in the intransitive form, a lost wallet can turn up on a park bench.
But the trap is trying to pair it with a concept that feels logically similar but breaks the hidden rules of English, right?
Exactly. We see this constantly. A very common error is a learner saying, I really need to turn up my spoken English skills.
Oh, I see. Logically, they want to increase their ability.
Right, but you cannot turn up a skill. You can increase the intensity of your study habits, but the abstract skill itself must be improved or honed. Another great example is weather. Someone might say, after the heavy rain, the sun finally turned up.
Because it arrived.
Right, but celestial bodies do not turn up. The sun comes out.
That is so tricky. My absolute favorite application of bending these rules, though, is how writers play with the structure to invent new concepts. Like J.K. Rowling taking this explosive upward energy and translating it into a pseudo-Latin spell to physicalize magic.
Yes, creating the incantation Turnipissimus.
It takes that raw sensory feeling of extreme expansion and dresses it up in ancient-sounding syntax so it feels like a real historical force.
It demonstrates how structurally versatile the underlying concept really is. Which brings us to the most complex and, frankly, the slightly darker part of this exploration, the deliberate psychological manipulation of the phrase.
So what does this all mean for how we influence the people around us? We are moving from simple cultural misunderstandings into the realm of mind control and the subtle power of grammar.
Let's start with syntactic framing, specifically focusing on the passive voice.
Okay.
When you use the transitive version of turn up, where an agent is acting upon an object, like adjusting a thermostat or applying stress, you can manipulate the grammar to completely deflect accountability.
Give me a real-world office scenario for that. How do people weaponize this?
Let's look at the active voice first. Management turned up the pressure on the sales team. In that sentence, it is crystal clear who committed the action.
Management did it. The blame is assigned directly to human beings.
Exactly. Now take the exact same scenario and shift the grammar into the passive voice. The pressure was turned up on the sales team.
Wow. You completely strip away the agent. The anonymity is instant. Think about how often we hear this kind of language at work. The server was turned up. The bandwidth has been turned up. Or the heat was turned up on the timeline.
Right. Bosses and politicians use these passive structures constantly to avoid taking personal responsibility for difficult decisions.
It makes corporate actions or controversial decisions sound like inevitable, invisible forces of nature. The object of the action, the pressure, the server, the timeline, becomes the grammatical hero of the sentence. And the human being who actually made the threat or clicked the button completely vanishes from the narrative.
It is incredibly subtle manipulation. You can go even deeper into neuro-linguistic programming, or NLP, using this specific phrase as a tool for hypnotic persuasion.
Hypnotic persuasion. Tell me more about that.
Yes, specifically utilizing the NLP Milton model. This framework is all about using artfully vague, soft presuppositions to bypass someone's conscious critical resistance.
Okay, give me an example.
Imagine you are a project manager. A deadline is looming, and a critical file of invoices is missing. A standard friction-heavy command would be, find those missing invoices immediately. Dig through the cabinets until you get them.
Which instantly triggers a stress response. The employee panics, gets defensive, and probably can't even think clearly.
The Milton model takes a completely different approach. It paces the employee's reality and uses a soft presupposition wrapped gently around our phrasal verb. Instead of shouting, the manager lowers their tone and says, "As we calmly review this stack of papers, the missing invoices are already beginning to turn up."
Already beginning to turn up. That is just linguistic sleight of hand.
It really is.
It makes the discovery of the documents feel like a foregone conclusion. You are not commanding them to frantically search. You are implanting this quiet expectation that the documents are naturally, inevitably floating to the surface on their own. It completely removes the panic from the room.
It bypasses the conscious filter because it sounds like an observation rather than a demand. But it is crucial to know how to defend yourself when someone tries to use vague, passive language on you.
And how do we do that?
That is where the NLP metamodel comes in. It is the tactical defense mechanism against linguistic deletion.
Right, when someone is actively trying to hide the facts of a situation.
Consider a scenario where a defensive accountant messed up the petty cash drawer but managed to borrow money and replace it before getting officially audited. When questioned, they might casually say, "Look, the missing cash just turned up this morning. The problem is solved."
They are using that intransitive Dickens-style passive form to make it sound like a miracle. It just turned up, like the cash just magically walked back into the building.
So as the manager, you fight back with a targeted meta-model question. You break their linguistic deletion by demanding the missing agent. You look at them and ask exactly who turned that cash up. It didn't walk into the safe by itself.
I love that. You force them out of the passive voice and pin them down to an active, responsible action. It is amazing how much raw power is hidden inside two tiny words if you actually understand the gears turning beneath the surface.
It proves that a phrase isn't just a definition in a dictionary, right? It is a behavioral tool.
Well, let's wrap up this journey we have been on today. We started by gripping a mechanical radio dial from the 1920s, slid through the bouncy phonetics of native connected speech with the American flap T, navigated the cultural clash of Charles Dickens and Gen Z corporate disasters, and finally landed on the hypnotic power of neuro-linguistic programming and deflecting blame.
The through line here is that mastering a language requires far more than memorizing vocabulary. It requires understanding the physical, historical, and psychological anchors that give those words their weight.
So for you listening, try paying closer attention to how you hear these simple words deployed in your daily life. Notice if a politician or a coworker is dodging blame with the passive voice, or listen for that incredibly fast flick of the tongue when someone casually tells you to turn it up in the car. But before we sign off, we want to leave you with one final provocative concept to mull over based on the sensory translation data we uncovered.
Yeah, when we analyzed the cognitive mapping of this phrase, we found that our brains do not just process text on a page. They instantly translate phrases into complex sensory experiences.
Right.
If hearing the phrase "turn up" automatically triggers a rapid, unconscious 5-second non-linguistic movie in your mind, a movie of vertical expansion, diaphragm contraction, and high-voltage energy, that how much of our daily reality is being secretly architected by the physical sensations of our vocabulary?
That's a huge question.
If just vocalizing these words forces your spine to elongate and your muscles to prep for a jump, could mastering this linguistic blueprint literally change how you physically feel before you even open your mouth to speak?
Wow. Something to think about the next time you tap that flat piece of glass to turn up the volume on your phone. Thanks for joining us in the deep dive.